And well, how can then threat modeling become something that's more fluent in agile projects and more compatible to those DevOps things? Well, then the idea was to use something very simple that combines the most of the benefits of something like code and has on the other side only as few as necessary of those drawbacks. That means not actually being something like code, but something similar to code, something more declarative. And the easiest to read markup language in my personal eyes, at least for a human, is YAML. So that's even easier to read than XML, obviously. And it's still very clearly defined, so it's very easy to parse, and all the IDEs can understand that. And we're having some more YAML kind of stuff in all those DevOps configuration things and how to define your DevOps pipelines, for example, and stuff like that. So developers are used to that. So the idea was to use that kind of idea to have a threat model as a YAML file in which you can describe, like in the actual threat model analysis, the data assets, not in terms of attributes and stuff like that. That's very, very too detailed, no, just in terms of the categories of the data you're dealing with. Because threat modeling also speaks about risks, and that means risks of data being breached, and some data are more valuable than some other data. So, for example, health data being very critical, of course, and very sensitive in these areas compared to, let's say, reporting data or stuff like that. So we can describe the rough data assets we are having in our architecture in that model and the components. These are the boxes one would usually draw in such a classic threat modeling workshop on the whiteboard, and the connections between them. So what component is speaking to what other component? The communication links. And at the end, you model the trust boundaries. So those kinds of boxes where the actual isolation happens, so that you isolate some components against the rest of the world or some other components. This is like in classic on-prem networking stuff. This is the network segmentation stuff like VLANs or DMZs. On the cloud, this is the security group thing. Or in the managed container clusters, it's stuff like the network isolation thing. So very isolate the reachability and visibility of components and more being more secure in those areas. Trust boundaries. Then the idea was to use an open source tool to analyze that kind of YAML file as a graph of connected components with data flowing between them. And I did some search on that and was not 100% satisfied with the candidates that I found. But then I thought, okay, so there must be something that we should create that generates then out of this model file, the nice model graphs. We still, as a human, need the visual representation, of course, so that we can spot whether we've possibly misplaced a component in a wrong area, in a wrong trust boundary, or whether we've modeled or missed to model a communication link in the wrong way. And so we just, as a human, definitely need to get this big picture, but that can be generated from that model. Also, threat modeling being about threats and potential risks and all these things. So these should be generated from the model by analyzing it as well, obviously. Including the hardening recommendations or the mitigation recommendations for the development teams or the architects on how to mitigate those identified potential risks. And that's for big corporations and organizations important. So all those required documentation stuff would be great. So to have some documentation and reports generated as well.